It's always such a pleasure for me to do these webinars with my colleague Barbara Patterson, who's a director of marketing here at 95% Group. And I would just have to say both of us are really proud to be part of 95% Group. And if you're not familiar with us and who we are, these are our foundational principles as an organization. We believe that all children deserve a chance to learn to read. And I'm guessing every single person that's joining us tonight has that same heart for their kids and what we want for our students. Our purpose is to unlock the power of literacy for every child, and we do that by building on the science to empower teachers and all educators with knowledge and resources and support. So that's really what we're all about. A little bit about me. I've been in education now for a really long time. I started as a teacher. I moved into administration, and I've actually spent most of my career as an organizational leader, specifically in the area of professional learning and specifically in the area of literacy. I've led several initiatives around the country and worked for many different organizations. Prior to this, I was with the Reading League, and I've been at 95% Group for about 2.5 years. You know, my through line of all of my work really is this commitment to literacy. And I actually have a mission statement here on the wall of my office that I want to contribute in the best way that I can to ensure that all children learn to read joyfully, enabling them to flourish as literate citizens of the 21st century. And this is kind of my own personal North Star. And I use this to kind of keep a pulse check on my contributions to my profession. So that's just a little bit about me. I'm guessing again that many of you, this resonates with all of you tonight. And I just want to express my sincere gratitude for all of you being part of this profession. It's a very noble profession. And I'm really pleased to be part of it. And I'm pleased to be here with you and supporting you in any way that I can tonight. All right, so we're going to explore together. And I call these explorations because, you know, I have a certain level of experience and I've had the gift of the wisdom and experience of others that kind of brings this topic to mind. So we're going to talk about transformational change and what questions we need to ask ourselves. And I'm hoping that as we go through our time together, and I share with you what I consider some bold leader moves, this might resonate with you, and this might affirm for you some of the things that you're already doing, and or give you some ideas on what are some next steps that you would like to take to delve a little bit deeper. So I've always been invested in and interested in the role of leadership and what role leadership plays in literacy outcomes for students. And so whatever role you play, consider yourself a literacy leader. And think about these different ideas that we're going to explore together and how they might apply to work that you do every day. This is part of a series that we're calling Science of Reading 2.0. And the content of this series is really based on this Science of Reading 2.0 implementation made easy. And this little booklet here, we've got the QR code, and Barbara's also going to drop that in the chat so that you can all have access to this booklet, because I will be referring to this as we go through the evening. So as you have this ebook, you can then go back to it and revisit some of the ideas that we'll be talking about this evening. So, and I wanted to let you know too, you know, really the whole purpose of this book was to really think about how are we connecting, you know, the reading science to actual actions that we can take in the classroom and actions we can take as leaders. All right, very good. So just to confirm and affirm that leadership is second only to classroom instruction among all the factors that contribute to what students learn at school. And that might be a little bit surprising. You know, sometimes we think, oh, you know, it's number of books at home or parents reading to their kids or whatever it might be. It's really the leadership, and whether that comes from you as leaders in your classrooms or in school districts, district leaders or school leaders, the role that you play as a leader is really important. Now, I'm wondering tonight if any of you that have tuned in are seeking some sort of a change, maybe some sort of a literacy change. And I want to share with you that the kind of change we're going to be really kind of discussing here is this idea of transformational change. Because many of us, as we look at the the literacy landscape, I like to call it, in this country, we see a great need for there to be a major change in how we do things in order to make sure all of our students have access to high quality instruction. And I think many of us are looking for transformational change because we have been availed to this body of research called the science of reading. And now we're thinking about, okay, what do I need to do to change practice to align to that science of reading? And so transformational change is really about kind of creating new systems and structures. And sometimes that means changing underlying values and beliefs. And transformational change is really designed to be collaborative. In other words, collaborative teams, which is why, again, all of you joining us tonight are part of a leadership movement that can enact this transformational change. And then I would also posit that transformational change really begins by asking big questions of ourselves. And from those questions, taking some pretty bold steps. So that's where we're going to begin tonight is if we need to ask bold questions of ourselves, what are those questions? What do we need to find out? What information or data is useful to us? So I'm going to start by sharing a couple of charts from a recent symposium that I did for leaders. And this, I just posed the question to them. What are questions that you need to ask yourself and your school teams in order to lead transformational literacy change? So I'm just going to pause here and let you take a look at some of these questions. And I want you to think about, do any of these questions resonate with you? Are these questions that in your role or in your school or in your district, you think need to be asked in order to start literacy transformation? If any of these resonate with you, go ahead and drop them in the chat. I'm curious to know if, as you're thinking about your own district or school, are there any of these questions that you go, yeah, this is one we need to explore? Go ahead and jot in the chat. Are there any questions that you see on this chat that resonate with you? In the chart that resonate with you that you think you want to explore in your own district or school? Will and skill. Thank you, Jennifer. Schedule. Yeah, do we have the adequate schedule in order to make this? Yeah, believing we can do it. Believe. So that gets back at, transformational change often starts with these deeply held beliefs. Yeah, is the core program, thank you, Stephanie, is the core program meeting the needs of most of our kids? If our core program is not meeting the needs of 80% or more of our students, we need to really rethink what's happening in tier 1. Yeah, good. Thank you. Thank you. Motivation, all of these things, yeah, data. I saw several people mention data. Are we looking at the data? Here's another set of charts. What's the data showing? Thank you for this. Yeah, I saw a couple people meant mindset, buy-in. Exactly. Very good. So these are all questions that I think that we need to start asking ourselves as we set about transformation. And I will tell you that really the key to answering those questions and moving the needle is really the key to that is looking at implementation science and how we implement change over time. And I'm going to be touching on that tonight, but at our very next webinar, we're going to do a much deeper dive into that implementation science. So good. Thank you. Thank you for your contributions. So here's in the Science of Reading 2.0, on page 16, you're going to see what I've encapsulated here as what I call 6 bold moves that we're going to explore tonight that really are kind of a compilation of many of those questions you saw that kind of arise organically from my conversations with literacy leaders all over the country in the years that I've been able to work in different districts and with different literacy leaders. So, to me, a big move here is to understand evidence-aligned instruction ourselves, right? We all have to understand that. Two, we have to be able to confront gaps in data. And several of you mentioned that. And I use the word confront here deliberately because sometimes we have to have really courageous conversations about what the data shows us. Number three gets at what I was just mentioning, this kind of district-wide literacy plan. And it also gets at that schedule issue that somebody put. Does our plan include making sure we have adequate time for literacy instruction? Number four gets at an ecosystem of curriculum resources. Number five, how are we supporting one another? And if you are an administrator, how are you supporting your teachers through professional learning? And that professional learning involves knowledge and practice, right? Not just knowledge. And ultimately, how are we planning for sustainability? Because frankly, we can start an initiative, but we also have to make sure that it endures beyond just the time that we focus on it. So we're going to unpack each of these tonight, and I will be giving you some time to just reflect on these things yourself and think about what are your next steps based on these bold moves. So, as a matter of fact, I'm this first bold move, understand the principles of evidence-aligned instruction. The first question we have to ask ourselves is, what do I need to know to lead some sort of a literacy transformation? And I was just going to share with you, I just finished filming a couple of podcasts for what's called TeacherCast. Maybe some of you follow the TeacherCast podcast. And I was able to interview some really incredible leaders in this TeacherCast podcast. And each of them said, learning alongside their teachers and making sure there's a coherent plan for learning is really critical. Now, many of you probably are very well versed in the science of reading and the principles around the science of reading, but I'm just going to give you some three resources that I think might be really helpful for you to make sure that you are really focused on the learning that we need to have, baseline learning that we need to have around the science of reading. So the first is, what is the science of reading? And for this, I refer you to the Science of Reading Defining Guide. I'm wondering if any or all of you have this. This was published by the Reading League. And what I love about this little guide is it gives us a really great baseline definition of the science of reading. It's a vast interdisciplinary body of scientifically based research about reading and issues related to reading and writing, right? Science of reading is not something we do. It's a body of research that informs what we do. And it's interdisciplinary: cognitive science, neuroscience, educational research, intervention, psychology. And we know a lot. We actually know a lot. When we say, this is spanned over 5 decades, there's a lot in this body of knowledge that we can tap into. And one of the things we know is what skilled reading is. And I always go back to, this is my second resource that if you're not familiar with, I encourage you to look at page 8 in your Science of Reading booklet to see Hollis Scarborough's beautiful visual metaphor. And while I think that most of you are familiar with it, just really quickly, the 2 ropes represent the domains of skilled reading: language comprehension and word recognition. And then those strands within each rope represent the skills and capabilities that we are teaching and developing. And as you can see, over time, those skills become increasingly automatic, and those language comprehension strands become increasingly strategic, and ultimately it results in that integration represented in skilled reading. So that's another tangible resource that you have available to you in this booklet: definition of the science of reading, the many strands that move into skilled reading. And then the third one I want to share with you is, this is Nancy Young's Ladder of Reading and Writing. And I think Barb's going to drop a link to that in our chat. So this visual guide, if you haven't seen it before, you can actually get it from nancyyoung.ca. This visual guide allows us to understand that reading is a learned skill, and it really looks at the level of ease in learning to read. So if you look at the top, for a very small percentage of us, learning to read seems very effortless, and we need to differentiate for those students with enrichment and extension. Moving down, 35 to 40% of our students, learning to read is relatively easy, but requires instruction. Moving down, the majority of our students, learning to read not only requires instruction, but explicit code-based instruction. And that includes the 10 to 15% of our students who require all of that and intensive intervention and repetition. So now, these are broad categories, but what the takeaway for me is, reading and writing are human inventions. They both require learning, and for the majority of us, that learning requires instruction. Because these are pretty broad categories, look at that purple arrow. What does that tell us? It reminds us that instruction is actually driven by data, right? We have to have the right data to inform our instruction and our differentiation. So that's what the third resource I want to leave you with when we think about our own understanding of evidence-aligned instruction. This is the book that Climbing the Ladder of Reading and Writing. It's a useful handbook for differentiation. It's been edited. It's edited by Nancy Young and Jan Hasbrook. I had the privilege of writing one of the chapters for this book and representing a panel of authors at the Reading League conference. I think this is a really important topic to explore, is how are we meeting the needs of all of our learners? All right, so that first big question I posed to you, what do you need to know about literacy transformation? So your reflection question is, where are you on your journey in understanding the science of reading and structured literacy? So I'm just going to pause there. You don't have to write it in the chat, but where are you in your own understanding, and what else might you need to fill in some gaps of understanding? I'm just going to pause there, let you think about that. All right. So think about that for yourself. What do you need to know, and where are you in your own transformation? So when I think about this first question, here's some bold leader moves, right? I think a bold leader move is make sure that we have a big, bold vision and a strong, steady mission, and that we keep literacy at the forefront of everything we're doing, because literacy is the priority. It's the gatekeeper for our students' success. And if we don't get literacy right, we don't get anything right. And to do that, we need professional learning. It needs to be a non-negotiable. And if you are an administrator, study and learn right alongside your teachers. I have to tell you a story. I had the pleasure of meeting a superintendent in Montana named Casey Bertram, and he served as on a panel that I moderated. And his story is really arresting. He said basically at his school, they had all kinds of banners, all students can achieve, all students will succeed. And at one point he kind of paused and he asked himself, do we really believe that all means all? Do all of us believe that all means all? And that really started him on a journey as a leader who had to confront the fact that we weren't delivering on those slogans, that they had significant numbers of kids who weren't reading. And he said that once they got real, then he had to challenge the staff to get real as well. And only with that realization that we want to deliver on the promise that all means all, were they able to really embark on this journey of transformational change. Another story, for this Teacher Cast podcast I was mentioning, I interviewed Kimiana Burke. And some of you probably know Kimiana. She's a national leader in literacy. And what I've heard her say many times is literacy is the most solvable of issues, right? I always try to remember that. Literacy is the most solvable of issues. We know what to do, and we can do it. All right, very good. So let's take a look at our second, big idea here tonight, which is that we have to confront gaps in data. So the question that comes from that, we have to ask ourselves is, what is the percentage of students reading at grade level at our school or district? And we have to have honesty and transparency in confronting that data, and go back to all, right? How are all of our students doing? Not just the average, like how are all of our students? We have to dig deep. Now, here is what's possible. We know that after research-based instruction, the percentage of first graders below that 30th percentile can be reduced to 4 to 6%. That's where we get our North Star, which is 95% or more of students can read with evidence-aligned instruction. So, this is what we have. This is where we have to think, what's our goal? If we're not there, if we're here, this is the gap of opportunity, right? Now, how do we know? Well, let's go back to Nancy Young's ladder. Remember that purple arrow? We need our data. So I love this infographic that we're using with permission from Deb Glazer and Jan Hasbrook. And it's really this instructional cycle that plays out. It's a visual guide that really helps us understand that the first thing we do is we deliver high quality evidence aligned tier 1 instruction to all students. Now, somebody in the chat mentioned, are we meeting the needs of most of our kids with tier 1? And if we're not, we have to think about how are we filling those gaps? How are we differentiating tier 1 to make sure that we accelerate kids to that core instruction? From there, we identify our students who are at risk, and we determine those individual needs for tiers 2 and 3, implement a plan, monitor their progress, and make changes or continue the plan, right? That's the basic instructional cycle. Where does assessment fit in? We want to make sure that we're providing screening for all of our kids, right? We have to have a good, accurate, universal screener to identify those students at risk. And by the way, I'm not going to mention this tonight, but I want us to always keep in mind that, the screening also identifies those kids who are above benchmark, who also get differentiation in terms of enrichment. But tonight we're going to be talking about those students who are at risk. From there, we want to provide good diagnostic assessments because we have to know how do we pinpoint instruction? How do I create an individual plan for these students? And then how am I monitoring that progress? How am I monitoring their progress to see if instruction is working, right? It's really, my progress monitoring is all about, is the instruction working? It's less about the kids, and it's more about, is our instruction having the intended effect? So here's the questions we need to ask ourselves. What is the percentage of students reading at grade level in our school or district? And kind of the sub-questions for your own reflection are, what is your current data? Do you have the valid and reliable assessments you need? And does that assessment connect directly to instruction? Right? So reflect on those for just a moment. The idea that assessment connects directly to instruction is really critically important. Diagnostics are designed to pinpoint, targeted, where the students actually need to be provided with learning opportunities to fill those gaps. So it has to connect directly to instruction. All right, very good. So our bold leader moves, we have to embrace this idea that all means all, as I mentioned earlier. We have to really research and use the best tools for universal screening. Like we just want to screen the students and figure out kind of, who's above, who's below, who's on benchmark. But then the most important thing is having good diagnostics. And the diagnostics should not only drill down into the skills that students need, but also inform our grouping and also connect to instruction. Making sure we have good progress monitoring every 1 to 3 weeks. Like we don't want the kids to get caught in what I call the cul-de-sac of intervention. We don't want that. We want to make sure that we're progress monitoring so that we can make adjustments based on the data. And of course, we have to make sure we know how to use the data. How do we administer our assessments and how do we look at the data? And finally, making sure that we have opportunities for collective problem solving where we can look at the data of all of our kids. So there's no blame game, right? There's no your kid's that, your kid's that. How do we collectively look at the data and say, what do we need as a system? What do we need as a system for universal and diagnostic and progress monitoring? And how might we cross-grade our students? How might we implement a walk to intervention or a walk to reading in order to really meet the needs of all of our kids? And I do have to give a shout out. As far as diagnostics, there's none better than our phonics screener for intervention, which is part of our literacy intervention system, which really takes the process from diagnostic assessment to grouping to instructional materials. It's a seamless process. So I encourage you to look into that. All right, very good. And I have to give a shout out. The last webinar of this whole series, I'm going to have Ken Wilbur, who's joining us tonight. He's going to be joining me for the last of this series. And Ken, I know we're going to be talking about a lot of this stuff, and you're going to be sharing your background as a courageous leader in leading transformation. So I look forward to that. All right, very good. So number three, what's our number three? What's our number three bold move? It's to build a coherent and focused district-wide literacy plan, which includes adequate time for literacy instruction. So the question we ask ourselves is, what do we want our students to know and do? And how do we get there? Now, that's a lot. We could spend, a long time really unpacking this, but I want to give you something to take away with you tonight. So one of the things we need to think about is making sure that we have adequate instruction for all tiers of instruction. And this graphic represents tiers of instruction. Tier 1 is for everyone. It's core. Now, I want to remind you, though, what I just said about that instructional cycle. Tier 1 doesn't necessarily mean whole group. Tier 1 can be delivered in a combination of whole group, small group. It can also be delivered in small groups. Let your data be your guide as to how you determine that Tier 1 delivery. Tier 2 is for students who require intervention, again, as determined by your data. And you'll see here from this graphic, it's a subgroup of students from Tier 1. So remember, these students are going to be receiving core, and in Tier 2 instruction, they're getting more time in smaller groups with targeted instruction based on diagnostic data. And students in Tier 3, going up that arrow, they're going to have a smaller subset of students receiving more time in small groups or individually with specifically targeted intervention. And it's important to remember the tiers represent additive, not replacement instruction, right? Additive, not replacement. I also want to make sure that we're all kind of aligned in this because tiers of instruction fit within an overall multi-tiered system of support, or MTSS. And I'm using this with permission of my friend, Stephanie Stoller, who really simplifies this so beautifully for us. Really what we're trying to do in an MTSS system is simply maximize student learning and instruction by matching their needs, using data and collective problem solving around that. So find out what the students need, provide it in the regular classroom, and then intensify that support as data indicates, going up that arrow with increasing time, intensity, and focus. So big question number 3, what do we want our students to know and do, and how do we get there? And some reflection questions that you may want to ask yourself are: number 1, does your schedule allow adequate time for all tiers of instruction? And number 2, do you utilize an MTSS framework that includes walk to intervention or walk to read? Because that's one way to think about how are you providing that adequate time. How are you creating a walk to intervention time in which students move across grades, even within grades and across grades, to get exactly what they need based on the data? If this is a new concept for you, that may be your next exploration. So think about it again. Some of these things I'm sharing tonight might be affirming, and some of them might be your next steps. So bold leader moves. Number 1, create a solid plan for literacy MTSS and implement it. Number 2, make sure we're utilizing our strongest specialists with the students who need the most time, intensity, and focus. Right? That's where our strongest specialists should be serving our students. Make literacy scheduling a priority so that all students can benefit. Now, if this is an area in which you're like, whoa, there's a lot going on here, Laura, and this is some new stuff for me. One thing that we are going to do tonight, we're going to give away 3 copies of this wonderful book called 10 Success Factors for Literacy Intervention. And this was actually written by Susan Hall. Susan Hall is the founder of 95% Group. She's the retired CEO of 95% Group. And she wrote this book because in her work, what she found is that many schools who are implementing an MTSS are getting great results. And those schools show the promise of implementing MTSS. But those schools who are getting weaker results may be leaving out some critical steps. And so she wrote this book to say, hey, Here's 10 factors that you have to consider for successful MTSS. All right, so let's close out this piece by just looking at this quote. I'll let you go ahead and read this to yourself. All right, if you do not get the Reading League Journal, I encourage you to think about getting yourself a subscription. It's got really great articles. This is from one back in 2022. And it was just really about, how do we, this is really important. Literacy is, again, the gateway. It's the most important thing that we do. And so how do we make sure that we're providing those important scheduling opportunities so that all kids get the instruction that they need? All right, so before I go on to number 4, Barb, do we have any questions? I'm not seeing any, just see some questions for you.
No questions right now.
Okay.
Continue. Yes, lots of links in there for everybody though.
All right, good. Thank you.
Sure thing.
All right, good. So when we think about number 4, if you go back to the 6 bold moves, number 4 was to adopt an ecosystem of proven curriculum resources that efficiently translates research to practice. And the question we need to ask ourselves, this is a tough one, what needs to go and what will stay, right? We call this pulling weeds and planting flowers, because if you have a garden, you cannot necessarily add to that garden until you pull some weeds out and make room for the flowers. So if you're following along with your Science of Reading 2.0, this is on page 24. This is just unpacking what we mean by a literacy ecosystem. And this might be a new term for you. A literacy ecosystem is a cohesive suite of resources that are both evidence aligned and evidence based, right? And I'll differentiate those for you in just a moment. Instruction needs to be data driven, aligned, consistent across tiers of instruction to accelerate outcomes for students. So I want to unpack this idea of alignment. So I want you to look at alignment. So think about across tiers, think about within grades, think about across grades. Why would we want aligned academic language? Why would we want aligned instruction? Why do we want aligned routines? Why do we want aligned teaching practices, right? What's the importance of alignment? What's the importance of alignment? Think about that for a minute. So think about academic language. If we have aligned and consistent academic language across all grades and tiers of instruction, that is going to eliminate the ambiguity that sometimes happens when we switch terminology with kids. And I'm going to give you a very specific example. This came from a teacher. She said, she said, it dawned on me that in first grade, I was calling it long vowel silent E pattern. But when my student would go to the interventionist, it was called magic E, the magic E pattern. The student did not know it was the same thing, right? So aligned academic language, both within tiers and across grades. Focused instruction simply means that the scope and sequence of, for example, the foundational skills is the same, but the intensity of instruction differs. So therefore, students are getting, again, additive, not replacement instruction. How about routines? I want us to think about, there are some very high impact routines that once we teach the students, they can use those routines over and over and over again, just changing the content of those routines. For example, some of you might use sound spelling mapping. Sound spelling mapping is a great routine. And as you teach kids different patterns, you can still use the routine of sound spelling mapping so that when you say to students, get out your spelling mats, boom, they know exactly what we're going to do, right? So the content can change, but the consistency of those routines is the same. So students can focus their cognitive energy on the content and the learning and not the process. That same consistency is really important for us as teachers, because once we know the routines, we can really focus on student response and adjusting instruction. So for example, with our teaching routines, I like to think of the I do, we do, you do gradual release model, right? It's a proven routine that when we enact it, that allows us to know what happens and how our lessons are going to unfold. And finally, we want to make sure that data alignment connects those tiers of instruction. So that's going to inform our grouping and provides visibility for all invested parties. So, for example, our literacy intervention system here at 95% group, it connects the assessment to the grouping, to the instruction, and the data is visible to all the parties who need to see the data, right? Really important. I'm going to let you read this to yourself. This is from Sharon Vaughn and Jack Fletcher. Read this to yourself. It's about alignment. So again, additive, not replacement instruction. I mentioned I was going to kind of differentiate what do we mean by evidence aligned versus evidence based. So here's some things I want you to keep in mind when you think about choosing resources. You want those resources to be evidence aligned, in other words, aligned to that body of research known as the science of reading, but you also want your resources to be evidence-based. There's efficacy studies to show that the resources work with real teachers, real kids in real classrooms. So if you want to take a look in your Science of Reading 2.0 on page 12, here's what we mean by evidence aligned. Here are 10 principles for evidence aligned literacy instruction, right? Number one, direct and explicit instruction, focusing students' attention on the learning. Number two, clear sequence, repeatable, replicable routines. Right. Number three, provide student practice with teacher support and error correction. Number four, ease up on that guided practice as you monitor your students. So that gradual release model. Principle number five, allow for independent practice, gradual release. Principle number six, use data to inform instruction. Principle seven, consolidate that learning with review, power of review. Number eight, active engagement in the learning. And number nine, enhance outcomes with evidence-aligned and research-proven resources. So think about those 10 principles of instruction as you think about how do you choose resources that are going to enable your teachers to enact and support these principles of instruction. Now, number 10 is remember the goal, and I'm going to read you the goal here. The goal. With evidence-aligned instruction, 95% or more of students can learn to read. Your passion for your students, combined with the relentless focus on using proven instructional practices, will allow you to deliver on that promise to your students. So evidence-aligned practices. Now, what about evidence-based? I hope many of you are familiar with Emily Hanford's series on American Public Media. The most recent of the series was Sold a Story. And perhaps some of you heard the recent news that came out of Sold a Story, but we won't go down that rabbit hole tonight. Nonetheless, if you are not familiar with Emily Hanford's reporting in American Public Media, she started actually several years ago reporting on education, literacy education in particular. And she, of course, in her findings, found in her research, in her reporting, found that not a lot of publishers actually invest in evidence studies because they're expensive, they're hard to do. I want you to know that one of the promises we make at 95% Group is to invest in evidence studies. Our products have evidence through rigorous research studies that really show the efficacy of our products. So there's a QR code here. You can scan this to learn more about our collection of efficacy studies. I encourage you then, as you think about choosing resources, as you think about what gets to stay and what needs to go, do you have resources that are aligned with the science of reading that are in place to support those key principles of instruction? And do your literacy resources have efficacy research that proves that they work in improving literacy outcomes? Use those as litmus tests to make those determinations for your literacy ecosystem. Okay. So your bold leader move is number one, hold high standards for efficacy and evidence when you choose those resources, and be courageous in de-implementation. on what is not effective or aligned with the evidence. And one of these, this is one of the hardest things to do sometimes, is give up some beloved practices to make room for others. Remember, it's not an additive process. When you see the need to change literacy outcomes for your students, don't just keep adding more. We have to think about, what do we take away to provide the most important instruction and the most effective resources. And these last two, you know what? If you're a decision maker, look at, do these resources make your teachers' lives easier? Do the resources provide professional learning through their use? I recently interviewed Robert Palazzo, who's a leader from Panther Valley. And I also interviewed a couple of other leaders from Southwestern School District, Rob Friel and Brian Cromer. And they're actually profiled in the Courage to Lead book. And they specifically both commented on these last two resources, last two bullet points, these attributes of, choosing resources that make teachers' lives easier. All right, very good. Number 5, and I see time's a ticking, isn't it, Barbara? My goodness sakes. All right, number 5. So we have to support our own collective knowledge and practice. And so are we making sure that our professional learning is consistent, provided for everyone? Everyone is a reading teacher. And are we basing our professional learning on outcomes? So go ahead, and if you're following along, this is on page 20 in your Science of Reading 2.0 booklet. So one of the reasons that in-service professional learning is so important is because many of us, and I wonder if this resonates with you, many of us were not provided evidence-aligned reading instructional principles in our teacher preparation. Now, I'll admit, I went through teacher prep a long time ago, but as I work around the country with different teachers and leaders, many of them say, I came out of teacher prep not that long ago, and I didn't know this. So perhaps that resonates with some of you. The thing I want to really pinpoint here, though, is it's not anyone's fault. There's no blame. There's no shame. We just have some unfinished work. And therefore, we have to fill those gaps in our own knowledge with high-quality professional learning. And high-quality professional learning is not just theory, and it's not just demonstration, and it's not just practice. For us to really change practice and to be really effective in the work that we do, coaching is critical. And some of you are probably familiar with the Joyce and Showers research around professional learning outcomes. Basically, what you'll see here is that, when we go to a professional learning event, if we're just presented with theory, there's not a lot of transfer to practice. A demonstration, more skill attainment, but again, no transfer to practice. When we are in a professional learning environment and we get to practice instructional routines, more learning, but again, not a lot of transfer to practice. Where the rubber hits the road is in coaching. I'm going to let you read this quote from Louisa Moats and note what she indicates as critical for every teacher who teaches reading. So funny story. I don't know if I told you this, Barbara, but I was actually showing this slide at a presentation in which Louisa Moats was present. And she looked at that. She goes, "Did I say that?" I said, "Yeah, you did." She goes, "That sounds pretty good." Agreed. We need education. We need good programs. We need ongoing professional learning, and we need coaching to really be at the top of our game, the top of our profession. All right. Moving on, then big question number 5 is the professional development consistent, provided for everyone, and based on outcomes? And so, does the professional learning plan support us in evidence-aligned practices, and is coaching a part of that PL plan? So our bold leader moves are, first of all, make sure we're providing professional learning and literacy for everybody. Every teacher is a reading teacher. I was recently in a in-service day in Indiana, and many of the teachers that came to the session were teachers of intermediate grade students, because they said, we have many students who are not proficient readers and we don't know what to do. We're not, we don't know how to provide that. So making sure we have professional learning for all is really important. And it needs to be ongoing and long-term. And we as leaders participate in that learning, and coaching and mentoring for all is really important for helping us with our practice, our professional practice. All right, last but not least tonight, we are going to just talk briefly about sustainability and building capacity, because no literacy transformation will sustain without our intentional building of capacity. Now, for this, we really need to look at the implementation science. And so I'm going to spend just a moment on this tonight. And you can see some of this on page 10 of your SOR 2.0 booklet. But I want you to know the very next webinar that we're holding in February, my colleague Terry Noland and I are going to be going much deeper into the implementation science. And I'll share that at the end of our webinar tonight. So just just briefly, what is the implementation science? It's really that scientific study of the methods that promote the uptake of research findings and bridge research to practice. That's the implementation science. So it's a body, it's a body of research, just like the science of reading. And I always like to say, that one of the things we're trying to do in this next evolution of the science of reading is blend together the science of reading, the science of learning, the science of instruction or teaching, and the implementation science, right? Research has shown that when we look at the implementation science, one of the principles of implementation science, as I said earlier, is to recognize that implementing any literacy change takes a number of years, and it also takes concerted, intentional effort. And part of that effort is building implementation teams and having clearly defined goals and having clearly defined methods. And this is a really interesting statistic. Without all that, if we just kind of haphazardly move into a transformational change, it can take 17 years to move half of an intended new initiative into practice, right? Whereas if you have a good, strong implementation program or plan, you can move the needle 80% in 3 years. So I don't know about you, but I don't have 17 years to move the needle 50%, right? This is an urgent thing we have to put time and attention to. So this is one of the ways that I like to try to think about implementation science. This is from the National Implementation Research Network Hub. So it's called NERN, and you could just look up NERN.org. I think it's org, National Implementation Research Network.org. And this is a really kind of cool way to think about why it's important when we think about all the pieces that go into a solid implementation. So like the simple view of reading, it's a multiplicative equation here. And we're going to start with the end in mind. So the first thing we think about is, well, what do we want our students, what do we want for literacy transformation? What are the socially significant outcomes we want? Well, I would say all of us on this call tonight would probably agree we want educational equity, we want literacy for all. Well, what are the factors that are going to get us there? Well, first of all, effective practice. What does that mean? That means evidence-aligned instruction times effective implementation. Well, what does that mean? That means support to implement that effective instruction times an enabling context. And what we mean by enabling context is the environment and setting in place to allow us to implement practice and support to reach our socially significant outcomes. Now, to drill down a little bit further, evidence-aligned instruction. Let's go back to those principles of instruction. Let's go back to the literacy ecosystem we talked about tonight. Effective implementation. Let's think about the professional learning and the ongoing coaching. Enabling context. What's a really critical part of this, of course, is literacy leadership. Now, I'm going to put some numbers behind this just to make it more real. I'm going to take a pretend school. And in this pretend school, we have implemented some of those principles of instruction, and we've adopted some good resources, but we're still using some resources from the past just because, well, we just don't want to de-implement them yet. Well, I'm going to give us an 80% compliance or fidelity to that. Effective implementation. Yeah, we're good. We've got lots of professional learning. Oops, we don't have coaching. Well, all right, I'm going to give us a 50% integrity on that. Our literacy leadership is strong, but we have a lot of literacy turnover in this pretend school. So I'm going to give us about a 60% integrity on that. We'll do the math. What this basically means is we have a 24% chance of effectively reaching our socially significant outcomes. So this equation helps me simply understand that for literacy transformation, we have to be all in, like all of these factors really matter. So this is kind of the core of what we mean by the implementation science. And again, at the next webinar in our series, we're going to dig deeper into what that implementation science involves. But that's really the key to building capacity. And to build capacity with the implementation science, we have to think about these things. First of all, what's our vision? Set it, live it, protect it. Number two, how are we creating an implementation team to help realize that vision over time? Sustainability also requires us to make sure that we're bringing up leaders. I'm a big fan of John Maxwell, and some of you might be a big fan of his as well. And he talks a great deal about investing and valuing others and bringing them up as leaders. Communication is the key to any sort of implementation, making sure that we all continue to be communicating internally around the data, around these action steps that we're taking, but also externally to the community that's heavily invested in the outcomes of their students, right? And of course, remember, progress, not perfection, right? We just keep moving forward with our next best step. So I went rather quickly today through these 6 bold leadership moves, but really what I want to leave you with is this. Hopefully there's a move here that intrigues you. Hopefully there's something here that affirms for you what you're already doing, because I know that you wouldn't be joining us tonight if you weren't a transformational leader. You are someone who influences people to think and speak and act to make a positive impact on your life and the lives of others. And I appreciate and applaud, again, the work that you do every day. And I hope that our time together today offers you some ideas to think about, some ideas to explore, right? So here's our explorations. And I would say, let's ask ourselves one last question tonight as we think about our next best steps. Let's ask ourselves, what would it be like if all of the students in your schools were readers? What would it be like? Okay, so just real quickly, on February 6th, I mentioned I'm going to be joined by Terry Noland, and we're going to be talking about implementation science. So you don't want to miss that. And then May 15th, Ken Kirby and I will be talking about, protecting your science of reading investment. Like, what do you need to know to make sure that you're getting the best possible results from investments that you make in resources and professional learning, and any sort of literacy transformation that you're undertaking. So if you're interested in learning more about 95% group products and professional learning, here are our our account executives and account associates. So please be sure to find your state here, and you can get the contact information of your account associate or account executive who can help you with more materials and more information about 95% group. Here's my information if you want to reach out to me at all. Happy to hear from you. Thank you, each and every one of you, again, for the work that you do every day. And thank you so much for joining us tonight. We really, really appreciate you. So, and we hope to see you next time. So have a great evening, everybody, and stay warm out there, and take care.